Welcome to the third episode of the Fountain Guide. In this episode we will replace the blockout with a target model along with the textures. I start from the base of the fountain. Create a cylinder with enough walls so that no sharp edges are visible. Then we adjust its height to the height of the base in the blockout. Then, using the inset option, I reduce the top base. It's also important to smooth the edges so the shading on the model works properly. In addition, we remove the lower base because it will not be visible in the engine anyway. Then, the model needs to be smoothed. Regular shade smooth only does part of the job. In the Normals tab, turn on Auto Smooth and increase it to the maximum value. Then, add a weighted normals modifier and increase face area value to 100. Thanks to this, we have a properly smooth model and properly behaving shading. Now it's time to create seams to split the texture on the model in specific places. Alt plus left mouse button selects all the edges in a circle. Click Ctrl E to add seams. Now we will need our texture. If you haven't done it yet, I encourage you to watch the second episode of the course. If you already have an exported texture, you can skip this step. Select the preset for Unreal Engine, 4K texture resolution and export your textures. Now we need to prepare the material in Blender. To do this, go to the Materials tab and create a new one, giving it an appropriate name. Then click on the small dot next to the base color and select Image Texture. Now we can use the File Explorer to open the previously exported texture. Then we select the third shading option in the upper right corner of the viewport. Thanks to this, we will be able to see our texture on the model. Now go to the UV Editing tab, and here we also enable the third shading option. You can select all polygons within the seams by using the L button and then the U button to unwrap selected area of the mesh. Using the UV Squares window, click to Grid by Shape button. Thanks to this, we will change our surface into one horizontal strip. We adjust our mesh so the UV surface perfectly matches the brick texture. I noticed that if I cut the edge I wouldn't get a good brick effect, so I decided to remove the seam and unwrap the mesh again. Once I was satisfied with the effect on the edge, I began to adjust the inside of the bricks to match the size of the previous ones. I also decided to move the texture horizontally to avoid visible repetition. Next step is to create the central part of the fountain. To do this, create a cylinder with 64 sides so the edges will not be visible. We also adjust the size to the one we made in the blockout. I start modeling the target object. I place the concept in the lower left corner to make it easier to see what element I am currently creating. The basic tools I use are extrude and scaling. These methods allowed me to obtain the shape I'm interested in. I constantly make sure that the scale of my objects agrees with what I did in the blockout. To make my work easier, I turned off perspective, set a side view and turned on transparency. This allows me to precisely adjust the height of the object. The middle part of the main element has fewer walls compared to the top and bottom. So I created a cylinder with 8 walls and removed the smooth center. Now we need to deal with the see-through center. I originally tried to enlarge the middle cylinder, but that didn't give me good results. So I decided to cover the basics from the top and the bottom. After doing this, I started to create a recess for the water. While creating the cavity, I noticed that the bases of the cylinder I had just added still existed. Because of this, I couldn't make a deeper recess for the water. I decided to remove them and deepen the fountain. Then I added a few more edges to round the cavity and make it less angular. I smoothed out the model using Shade Smooth and started adding sharp edges. They are added in the same way as we created seams, but instead of Mark Seam, we select Mark Sharp. Turn on Auto Smooth to 180 degrees and mark the remaining sharp edges. When we are satisfied with the results, we move on to the texturing part. As in the case of the base, here we also apply the same material with previously prepared texture. Here we also need to mark the edges that will cut the texture, so in addition to Mark Sharp itself, we also need to mark Seam. After cutting the mesh, we place it in the appropriate place on the texture. We do the same with the upper part. We mark the edges and add Mark Seam, unwrap everything on the texture and place it in the appropriate spots. We do this with every element. We hover the mouse over the place we want to unwrap, press L to select a given fragment, press U to unwrap it and stretch it using the Grid by Shape option. Once I've created the foundation of the fountain, it's time to make the detailed center section. We start by reducing the faces using the Inset tool with the individual options selected. After reducing the walls, we can push them inside using the Extrude option. I noticed that the middle part is too high compared to what is in the concept, so I'm reducing this part a bit. To avoid holes, I decided to move the upper part of the fountain to the bottom. After correcting the upper part of the fountain, the remaining elements should also be lowered a little to maintain the proportions. Once I'm satisfied with the scale of individual elements, I return to creating the detail. To do this, I use the Inset option of the front wall, split it in two, and use the Bevel option on the newly created edge. Now I added additional edges to make another recess in the wall and then smooth out the sharp edges using the Bevel option. Then I divided the middle division into two and removed the middle part while patching the resulting holes using the bridge option. Then I created a cylinder that will be our decoration in the middle of the wall and adjust it to the right place and scale. Then, using extrude, we create rays coming from the cylinder and adjust their shape. After creating the pattern, we duplicate it, move it to the side and remove the center from it. Then I remove the rays from the duplicated element and use the bridge option to patch the holes until we obtain a flattened cylinder. Then I also use the inset option to remove the back walls to obtain the effect of flattened ring. Now I fit our additional ring into the center of the first one and improve its shape and size. Then all I had to do was make the eye, which is an ordinary cylinder, and this way we obtained a modeled detail on one of the walls. At this stage, I already know that all I need to do is to create two walls and copy them around. To do this, I rotate the central part of the fountain in such a way that the axis of the wall on which I will be working is perpendicular to the central point. After making sure what the wall should look like, I added the missing edges and pushed the shape I was interested in into the fountain. Then, having marked sharp edges on the edges of the wall, I scaled them to obtain a shape similar to the one in the concept. Once this is done, you can go ahead and remove any unnecessary and untouched walls. Then I duplicated the already created walls and rotated them around the fountain, and then connected all the elements together using the Ctrl-J option. However, I noticed that everything fits perfectly, but it took less work to smooth the edges and trim the texture on 2 walls instead of 8, so I took a step back and then took 2 steps forward. First, I select all the sharp edges that I want to smooth using the bevel option. Then I prepare the weighted normals modifier and apply mark sharp to the edges that I want to remain sharp. When I'm satisfied with the results, I move to the other wall and do the same. Once all the walls have sharp edges applied, it's time to apply seams as well. We do the same with the second wall. Select all the edges that are to be separated on the texture and select Mark Seams. Once we've finished adding sharp edges and seams, it's time to apply texture to the prepared section of the wall. This time we don't break all the walls into one horizontal strips. Sometimes we leave the texture as it is and simply place it in the right place. I was wondering what to do with this damaged part of the texture, but fortunately using the Live Unwrap option helped me solve the problem and the texture was unwrapped correctly. When all wall fragments are textured, we can return to our layout window and duplicate the created element to fill the missing walls in the fountain. Once we have done this, we enter the vertex editing mode, select all of them and use the Merge by Distance option to combine all the vertices that are in the same position. Now it's time to create the upper part of the fountain. In the first episode, when I was creating a blockout, I divided each wall of this element into two. Now we'll use it. Select the edges coming from the top base of the cylinder and use scaling to enlarge them a bit. Thanks to this, we are able to soften the upper cylinder while maintaining the angular shape of its lower part. Then we apply weighted normals to the edges that we want to keep sharp and remove unnecessary surfaces. Previously I had cavity turned on to see the edges more clearly. Now I will turn it off to see the smoothing of the cylinder. Now I add the missing edges to soften the shape of this element. Remember to use the weighted normals modifier again after each change made to the model geometry. It's time to model the upper fountain. Using the concept, I will make final corrections to the scale. Then I enlarge the top base of the cylinder to create a bowl shape. I also take out the lower base to soften the shape of the solid from underneath. Now I add additional edges to highlight the top of the fountain and use extrude to create a recess for the water. Then I apply transforms to this object and bevel the edge so it's not so sharp. I'm adding additional bevels to soften this object. After softening all the edges, I apply the weighted normals modifier again. Before we start modeling the element from which water is leaking, let's apply textures to the previously created elements. As in the previous elements, apply mark seams to the appropriate edges. I want there to be a pattern just below the top water bowl, so I add seam there as well. Once I'm happy with the results of the unwrapped texture, we move on to the next object and do the same thing. Once we have texture applied, we return to the layout view, unhide the hidden objects from the blockout and start creating the last element of the fountain. Create a cylinder on which we put an additional edge on the top and use extrude on the loop created at the top. We add small details, remembering that this element will be hardly visible, so there is no point in adding large geometry here, as it will affect performance. We apply weighted normals and start texturing the object. We continue to create a fragment from which water will flow out. As before, we add small protrusions to add a bit of details. We add mark sharp, check what our object looks like from distance, and make any corrections. Now it's time to add seams and texture the object by placing it on the metal part. Now I'm duplicating a fragment of the loop from the metal part of the fountain because I want to add there a golden ornaments created in the second episode. I widen the duplicated fragments only a little because I don't want it to be visible that the objects are levitating in the air. After doing this, I place the texture in the place of the ornaments, thanks to which we obtain decorations in the places we were interested in. Now I need to make a set of pipes from which water flows out. To do this, I create simple cylinders in various sizes that I will place on the top of the fountain. Once I have the right shape, I add seams and texture these objects. The last thing we need to do before exporting our object to Unreal is to prepare a flower pot. We remove the spheres and other unnecessary elements and leave the base of only one pot. Using our blockout, we add several surfaces to smooth out the shape of our model. After preparing the shape, I added some extrudes to add detail to this object. Now, using inset and extrude, I add recess in the pot. Then I do what I did in every previous object before texturing. I add mark sharp and make sure that the shading of my object is correct. When I'm satisfied with the effect, I add some detail in the form of thickening on the sides of the pot and add the weighted normals modifier. When all the work on the pot mesh is finished, it's time to texture it. I add the missing seams, make any corrections to the geometry and arrange the mesh on the texture. After texturing the pot, all that was left to do was place them around the fountain. I spread them out by hand because when people put pots around the fountain, they didn't do it with compasses, they just brought them and put them in the indicated place. After doing this, I combine all the vases into one object. In this way, we have a prepared model ready to export from Blender and import in Unreal Engine. If you liked the episode, subscribe for more.